Well, I didn't see that coming. So, yeah, in complete defiance of everyone's expectations, Apple TV Plus announced via Twitter on March 2nd, 2023, that there would in fact be a second season of their phenomenal dinosaur-focused series, Prehistoric Planet. And if that wasn't shocking enough, they even gave us a release date, May 22nd, 2023. Nearly 1 year to the T that the first season premiered in 2022. This is pretty shocking news for a variety of reasons. First of all, there was a lot of uncertainty regarding whether or not Prehistoric Planet would get a second season at all. No official announcements had been made, and there are a number of compounding factors that made speculating on the prospect very difficult. Among these was the fact that streaming services notoriously do not report their viewing figures publicly, so we don't actually know how many people streamed the show upon its premiere during the week of May 23rd, 2022. That's not to say we know nothing about its apparent success. According to streaming aggregate Just Watch, Prehistoric Planet was the number 5 most streamed series that week, behind Obi-Wan, Better Call Saul, Stranger Things Season 4, and Yellowstone. That's pretty impressive for what is ostensibly a BBC nature show, and all the more impressive considering it made it back into the top 10 viewed series during the week of July 20th, according to Parrot Analytics. The problem is we can't attach numbers to these values. For all we know, there could have been a steep drop-off between number 4 and number 5. Prehistoric Planet was almost certainly successful. The question was it successful enough? Prehistoric Planet's budget has yet to be disclosed, but it was almost certainly pretty costly. If we look at the original Walking with Dinosaurs, released in 1999 as a sort of general guide, that series had a budget of 6.1 million British pounds sterling, or 9.9 million US dollars. If we adjust for inflation, that amounts to about 17.2 million US dollars today. This can provide us with a rough estimate for how much Prehistoric Planet probably cost to produce. It's not much compared to other big shows. For example, House of the Dragon ran around $20 million per episode, but it's not nothing either. Did Prehistoric Planet bring in enough subscribers to Apple TV Plus for it to be profitable against its estimated budget? Without numbers, we can't know for sure. There's also the fact that even when shows are successful, streaming services can drag their feet in announcing a second season. Just ask Sandman fans. So until we got an actual announcement, there was no way to be sure. Luckily, that announcement has finally come, but with it come even more questions. The most interesting of which, to me, is how they were able to produce an entire second season in just a year's time. There are some conflicting reports on when exactly Prehistoric Planet began development. Paleontologist and series consultant Steve Brusetti claims that it was in production for over a decade before its release. But if we look at some of the behind-the-scenes material and interviews, it seems more likely that that's when executive producer Mike Gunton actually came up with the idea. Gunton had the idea over a decade ago, but was unable to find anyone willing to produce the series given how expensive and risky something like Prehistoric Planet would be.
I remember I was standing on a mountain with David Attenborough for the Africa series. One of the lines he was saying was, "Nowhere on the planet does wildlife put on a greater show." And I started thinking about, I wonder what it would have been like to have stood here when the dinosaurs and the creatures were at their finest moment. And I thought, I wonder if you can actually make a show like that about dinosaurs.
The series mentioned by Gunton at the beginning of this account is Africa, released in 2013. So that would line up with Brusetti's statement. Fortunately, this sort of development limbo would come to an end upon his discussions with Prehistoric Planet executive producer Jon Favreau during Favreau's work on The Lion King in 2019.
But of course, it's not that easy to do. So a few years went by, we were thinking about making some of the stories, and then I met somebody who could help, John. And we met in an office in London, and we were talking about lions. But we had a kind of meeting of the minds about our approach to wildlife. And I suddenly realized, this is the person who had the keys to that time machine. So once we had the time machine, we were off. And that's how Prehistoric Planet got made.
This would also line up with the series' official announcement and deadline during May of 2019. This means that from when it was greenlit to when it premiered, Prehistoric Planet Season 1 probably took around 3 years. So how could a whole second season be produced in less than half that time? There are a few different possibilities that I want to go over, but all of them rely on the same basic idea. That Season 2 will consist of material that was conceived and developed during the production of Season 1. There are 3 ways in which this could be understood. 1. This was the plan from the beginning. 2. This decision was made following the success of Season 1. 3. This was a tentative plan made during the production of Season 1. The first possibility is pretty straightforward. They had planned to produce 2 seasons all along, so they shot and edited everything all at once, and simply staggered the release schedules. Not impossible, but I can't help but feel that if this was the plan from the beginning, then it would have been announced as such. Apple to partner with BBC Nature to produce 2 seasons of new dinosaur-focused series. If they were confident enough to produce 2 seasons, why wouldn't they be confident enough to advertise 2 seasons? Don't get me wrong, just because this decision is weird doesn't mean it can't also be true. Studios do weird things all the time. Still worth pointing out, though. The second possibility can basically be thought of as a retroactive decision. In other words, the producers would have realized they had enough leftover concepts and footage to fill out a second season. The main problem with this one is that it would require a lot of unplanned, unused material. It's one thing for there to be enough left over for 1 episode or even 2, but 5? This brings us to the third possibility, the one that I think is most likely, which is that there was some tentative plan to produce 10 episodes, but this was eventually cut down to 5. One likely scenario is that the live-action photography unit shot enough on location for 10 episodes, but Apple was worried about the cost of completing the visual effects for all of them. As a compromise, they cut the series down to 5 episodes, with the option to finish the other 5 if the first season was successful enough. Like I said, I think this is the possibility that has the best evidence behind it. In order for the turnaround to be this quick, there had to have been some kind of plan for it, even if it wasn't a solid one. This would also explain why those working on the show were obliged to maintain discretion even following the series premiere. Now, a lot of us kind of assumed that was because there was some sort of supplementary material forthcoming, like a behind-the-scenes special or a book detailing the science or something like that. But it looks like the real reason was this second season, so that's pretty exciting. Regardless of the exact specifics of the scenario, it might be easier to imagine this not as Prehistoric Planet Season 2, but as Prehistoric Planet Season 1, Part 2. In other words, don't expect Season 2 to be significantly different in any meaningful way from Season 1. For example, we already know for a fact that the series will remain confined to the Maastrichtian stage of the Late Cretaceous period. So anyone hoping the future seasons would explore other time periods are going to have to keep on waiting. We also know that while the next season will undoubtedly introduce new ecosystems and new animals, we will also be returning to ones we've seen before. T-Rex is name dropped in the official announcement, which appeared twice in Season 1. The only other animal officially confirmed to appear is the ankylosaurian ankylosaurid, Tarkia. While the announcement treats the appearance of Tarkia as something new, astute viewers will be aware that Tarkia actually was in Season 1 in the Deserts episode, albeit fuzzy and in the background. This makes it likely that we will be returning to the Nemeth formation as well. We also shouldn't expect the format to change. There has not been enough time for them to really consider any of the feedback from Season 1. Anything that was the result of early conception is gonna remain the same. We should expect 5 episodes, each centered on a different biome or habitat, each one about 40 minutes in length, and each one broken up into 6 segments. If you're like me and you thought some of the narratives of the segments were disjointed and uneven, don't expect that to change either. As far as other things we know are staying the same, we know that Attenborough is providing the narration, and Bleeding Fingers Music will produce the soundtrack. Okay, so that's all the stuff that's staying the same. And what can we look forward to in terms of new content? As I said earlier, there are only 2 animals that are confirmed to be in the series so far. Both of them are technically animals that we've already seen before. T-Rex, and Tarkia. T-Rex is pretty obvious. I mean, come on, it's T-Rex. You knew that was going to be the case. There's even a good chance it will once again have more than one segment. Tarkia will be getting some time in the limelight after being shunted into the background of the Water Truce segment of Deserts. I always thought it was weird that they bothered to include Tarkia given its lack of prominence. Like, there's already a lot of dinosaurs here. Why go through the trouble of modeling, animating, and rendering another one if we don't even get to see it? Funnily enough, the same could be said for the Therizinosaurus that also shows up in this segment, which also ended up getting its own story later in Season 1. That's all for officially confirmed animals, but we do have evidence for the appearance of some others as well. In this tweet from March 11th, lead consultant and creature designer Dr. Darren Naish seems to heavily imply that Triceratops will be in Season 2. This makes sense, given we know T-Rex is returning, and the two are contemporaneous. The rest of the prospective animals I want to talk about are all contingent on the idea that Season 2 represents a continuation of what was created for Season 1, which isn't proven, so take all this with a grain of salt. In this production photo released for Season 1, we see a silhouette of a pachycephalosaur used as reference on location. Given that there were no pachycephalosaurs at all in Season 1, which is itself a suspiciously glaring omission, we might assume that this silhouette was meant for footage reserved for Season 2. Given the size and proportions, we can be pretty confident that this is Pachycephalosaurus itself, which, again, would have been concurrent with T-Rex and Triceratops. We shouldn't assume that all three will be in the same segment, but it is certainly possible. Then we have this animatic, which first appeared on the Motion Picture Company's YouTube channel in February of 2023, as part of a compilation of the visualization of the series. Rather intriguingly, the video was made private shortly afterwards. It depicts two abelisaurs, which others have identified as Rajasaurus, picking off baby sauropods which have been identified as Isosaurus. We also see a faint glimpse of some kind of reptile, possibly a crocodilomorph. Lastly, there are a number of pieces of concept art that seem to represent unused elements that didn't make it into Season 1. Again, we can't automatically conclude that they represent things reserved for Season 2, but going off the idea that Seasons 1 and 2 represent one large stage of production, then it's entirely possible. We know for a fact that the episode release schedule will be identical to that of Season 1. 5 episodes, released on 5 consecutive nights, each one focusing on a different habitat, broken up into various segments, 6 if Season 1 is anything to go by. The trick here is determining which habitats will be featured. The main problem when trying to figure this out is that we don't know nearly enough about the biomes of the Maastrichtian as we do about those of today, so the options are a lot more limited. Given that 5 are pretty much off the table from the start, having already been used for Season 1, the pickings are pretty slim. However, there is one that we can be relatively confident about. A lot of the supposedly quote-unquote unused concept art features dinosaurs in dry, rocky locations with little vegetation. In fact, one of these pieces, this one with the Pachycephalosaur and the Dromaeosaurs, is apparently titled Clifton Badlands. This could mean that one of the episodes of Season 2 will focus on Badlands. According to Wikipedia, Badlands are, quote, a type of dry terrain where softer sedimentary rocks and clay-rich soils have been extensively eroded. They are characterized by steep slopes, minimal vegetation, lack of substantial regolith, and high drainage density. Ravines, gullies, buttes, hoodoos, and other such geologic forms are common in Badlands. Unfortunately, that's as far as the evidence can take us with regards to the episodes. Possible insight may be found in other series that have a similar format. Prehistoric Planet, by its own admission, is Planet Earth 66 million years ago. So let's look at Planet Earth 1 and 2 to see what they did. The episode list for Season 1 consists of From Pole to Pole, Mountains, Fresh Water, Caves, Deserts, Ice Worlds, Great Plains, Jungles, Shallow Seas, Seasonal Forests, and Ocean Deep. For Season 2, we have Islands, Mountains, Jungles, Deserts, Grasslands, Cities, and World of Wonder. Right away, we can see some striking similarities, especially in Season 1. 3/5 of the episodes from Prehistoric Planet Season 1 appear in Planet Earth Season 1. Hell, Freshwater even has the exact same slot in both series. The other two episodes have fairly similar analogs, forests with seasonal forests and coasts with shallow seas. It's not unreasonable then to assume that the roster for these series can be a useful guide to fill in the gaps for Prehistoric Planet Season 2. If we stick with the idea that one episode will center on Badlands, that gives us 4 slots to fill. We can use process of elimination to rule out some of these. We can rule out freshwater, deserts, and ice worlds because those have already been done. Now, I know what you're thinking, but Patrick, aren't some of the episodes reused for Season 2 of Planet Earth? Yeah, but that's because Planet Earth Season 2 came many years after Season 1. Prehistoric Planet is unlikely to repeat things since there's only a year's difference in between them. And again, if we go back to the idea that Season 2 really is just a continuation of Season 1, then you're not going to repeat something in the same season. Let's also go ahead and rule out seasonal forests and shallow seas because those are too similar to episodes we already have. We can also be pretty confident that From Pole to Pole isn't a useful guide because its format is a bit of an outlier, and World of Wonder is more a tribute to Attenborough himself. So what does that leave us with? Mountains appears in both series, so it's tempting to think that that will be a surefire episode for Prehistoric Planet Season 2. However, there's a big problem. We know nothing about dinosaurs that lived in mountains. Our knowledge of dinosaurs is constrained entirely by what's preserved in the fossil record, and mountains are not good places for preserving fossils. Firstly, the processes that create mountains usually destroy any fossils already preserved in them. Also, mountains themselves have low preservation potential because in order for fossils to form, sediment needs to be deposited on a surface, and you can't really deposit sediment on a slope. Having said that, mountains are a great source of sediments that can be eroded by wind and rain and deposited at the base of those mountains. I have little evidence to back this up, but I believe that Badlands is going to be the substitute for mountains. You'll get a lot of the same sort of visuals in terms of the terrain, but with actual fossil data to use. So that rules out mountains because the slot's already taken. We run into similar problems with caves and jungles, neither of which are good places for fossils to form because they don't really allow for sediment deposition. I think we can also be pretty confident that cities aren't going to feature either. What does that leave us with? Seasons 1 and 2 of Planet Earth feature 2 very similar episodes, Great Plains and Grasslands. Grasslands is unlikely given that grass had only recently evolved by the Maastrichtian and is only known from India, but Great Plains they could make work. You don't need grass to have savannas or prairies. That role can be occupied by things like ferns or conifers. In fact, many of the most fossil-rich locales on Earth today represent what are called floodplains, large expanses of flat land that are occasionally flooded when nearby rivers and lakes overflow their banks. These floodwaters are great sources of sediments, so they have high preservation potential. So I think there's a high chance that we'll get a Great Plains-like episode in Season 2 of Prehistoric Planet. How about islands? This is another one they could conceivably make work given what we know about the Maastrichtian. The most famous island of the entire Mesozoic is Hattag Island, located in present-day Romania, during a time when much of Europe was submerged in a shallow sea. Madagascar had already broken off from Africa and India by the Maastrichtian, and we have been to Madagascar and Hattag Island before in Prehistoric Planet. Hell, you could even argue that India would count as an island because it hadn't collided with Asia by that point. So I think there's enough material to make islands work, so I'm going to add it to the list. Last on the list is Ocean Deep. Now, I highly doubt that there will be an episode devoted to the literal deep ocean, because the fossil record tells us next to nothing about the deep ocean of the deep past. But we could get another episode focusing on the ocean. Rather than sticking to the coast, the series could take us out to the open ocean. In fact, there is a crumb of evidence to suggest that this might be the case. This piece of concept art for Prehistoric Planet is labeled High Seas. However, the art itself is of the T-Rex segment from Coast, so it seems more likely that the episode's name was changed at some point. Having said that, another ocean-themed episode is entirely possible, and without any other suggestions, I'm going to add it to the list. That leaves us with one open slot for a 5th episode. Given everything we've talked about, as well as what we know about paleo environments, I think the most likely biome to fill that slot is something like wetlands or marshes or something like that. There are loads of Maastrichtian formations that are deposited in wetlands, so that just seems like the simplest way to go. The only point I can think that would count against it is that it does step on the toes of freshwater a little. But freshwater was always pretty nebulously defined anyway, and the only segment in that episode that takes place in a swamp is the Quetzalcoatl segment, which barely even references the fact that it takes place in a swamp. So yeah, I'm going with wetlands. That gives us a nice, relatively diverse set of episodes with plenty of animals that would relate to them. There is one final thing I think is worth discussing, and that's sort of what we should expect generally from Season 2 in terms of what sorts of ideas and hypotheses they'll choose to depict. As I said earlier, I think we're going to get a lot of the same things that were common in Season 1, so expect a lot of emphasis on sexual selection, mating and display, expect speculation in the vein of All Yesterdays, and expect a lot more baby death. Having said that, I do think there is a way to speculate on what other sorts of things we might expect based on the research of lead consultant Dr. Darren Naish. Prehistoric Planet is very much Naish's show, at least in terms of how it portrays its animals, and what sorts of ideas are communicated. This means that if we look at what sorts of things Naish has published on, I think it's reasonable to predict that those are the sorts of things we'll see in Season 2. And I say that because we can do this in reverse, correlating his research with some of the ideas that were presented in Season 1. In 2021, Naish co-authored a paper arguing that pterosaurs were most likely capable flyers soon after hatching, and this may imply a precocial lifestyle. This was portrayed in the Alcyone segment of Episode 1. In 2017, Naish co-authored a paper that looked at CT scans of theropod dinosaur skulls, specifically Neovenator, and concluded that the faces of theropods were probably very sensitive to tactile stimulation. We saw this with T-Rex in Episode 3. Also in 2017 was a paper in which Naish and colleagues looked at biomechanical models of plesiosaur flippers and argued that they swam with the front flippers generating most of the thrust, while the hind flippers pushed off vortices of water generated by the fore flippers. This is the same model of locomotion used for the elasmosaurs throughout the series. So what else has Naish published on that might provide insight into the content of Season 2? Most of these subjects have already been featured in Season 1, such as the role of sexual selection in the evolution of extravagant structures in dinosaurs and pterosaurs, but there are two things in particular that stand out to me. The first is Woodruff, Naish, and Dunning 2020, which examined the widespread phenomenon of photoluminescent tissue in living animals, including birds, and hypothesized that we should expect them to be present in non-avian dinosaurs as well. To be clear, this is photoluminescence, not bioluminescence. What this means is that dinosaur tissues may have emitted light and color ordinarily invisible to us, but which could be seen under an ultraviolet light. This is precisely the sort of informed speculation that the series made great use of in the first season, so it would make a lot of sense for it to be in Season 2. Having said that, just because it would make a lot of sense or would be a good idea doesn't necessarily mean they'll do it, but if they're smart, they will. The second point is a bit more general, but also a pretty strong one. Over the last 10 years, Naish has published a whopping 9 papers dealing with geologic formations that correlate to the famous Hatteg Island. This includes everything from mixed vertebrate assemblages, ornithopods, theropods, and numerous asdarchid pterosaurs. It seems even more bizarre, then, that Hatteg basically had what amounts to an extended cameo in Season 1. Episode 5 concludes with a brief detour to Hatteg Island, but there's no real narrative or focus. It's just, here's a forest with a bunch of animals that live in it. The island isn't identified by name. I don't even think it was identified as an island. Given that the series did, and will, revisit locations, I would be very shocked if we didn't go back to Hatteg Island at some point, especially if we go with my earlier episode predictions. Alright, I think that's all there is to reasonably say regarding what little we know of Prehistoric Planet Season 2. Honestly, it's kind of amazing that we're getting more of this incredible series so soon after the end of the first season. Hell, it may even inspire me to do that full series review I've put off for nearly a year. I'll leave the video with one final thought. Given that the release schedule for Season 2 is basically identical to that of Season 1, we should expect the marketing to follow a similar schedule. That means that we may be lucky enough to get a short teaser and/or a clip around the beginning of April, and the full trailer will almost certainly release around the end of April. So I'll see you then, when there'll be much more to talk about. So actually, scratch that last bit, because life is unfair and constantly moving and always hectic. Here's the real last thought. After recording, Darren Naish posted this tweet, which says, quote, "There's lots of speculation about the contents of Prehistoric Planet Series 2. You're most definitely not going to be disappointed. Bigger and better, more and different animals, and as I've said in books and articles, the Cretaceous was not a dinosaurs-only theme park." So this gets to something that was an immediate observation for me in season 1, which is that the show overall was very dinosaur-focused. Now, that's not exactly surprising, or like I'm not sitting here scratching my ass going, oh, there's so many dinosaurs in this dinosaur show. It's just that given Darren's proclivities towards life in the Mesozoic era, it did strike me that there weren't as many non-dinosaurs as there might have been. And you might be saying to yourself, but what about all the pterosaurs and marine reptiles? Yeah, those are dinosaurs. Not phylogenetically, not from a taxonomic standpoint, but in terms of sort of the way they are perceived by the general public, they're dinosaurs. So we didn't get a lot of crocodilomorphs. Indeed, I don't think we got any crocodilomorphs. We got Beelzebufo, briefly. We had Simulestes, which went unnamed and only served to be eaten by the Troodontid. We just did not have a lot of non-dinosaurs in the show in general. So I always figured that was sort of a compromise, because Prehistoric Planet is uncompromising on many things, including the science. But if you're not going to make concessions on the science, in terms of making it more appealing to a mass audience, then you got to make concessions elsewhere. You know, I can easily see someone like Darren being like, hey, we want to show off like crazy crocodilomorphs and Mesozoic mammals and, things like that. And the producers being like, no, we want dinosaurs. So it's entirely possible that they developed a lot of concepts that would utilize non-dinosaurs. But again, they opted to go for the safer option for season 1. After that proved successful, now they're probably going to take a chance. Now Prehistoric Planet is a name. Now it has a brand. It has recognition. So they have a little bit more freedom to take those risks and show us more animals besides dinosaurs. So this gives me hope that we'll see a lot more non-dinosaurs in the show. There are a lot of possibilities, a lot of things they could do. Darren is no stranger to the crazy creatures of the Mesozoic that are not dinosaurs, not pterosaurs, not marine reptiles. So, yeah, here's the real final thought, and it's another good one. So, stay on that hype train, because this series more than deserves it.